And what's really happening is that these kind of communities, their own kind of social group stays intact to a large extent. Even if I'm at this campus, these other kids are somewhere back in their communities, some are at other schools, and so on and so forth. But they're forming through social networks a very powerful, personalized kind of learning media that has some very interesting properties to it. And heaven help you, if you try to go give a lecture in today's schools, you'll find that every student is sitting in front of you doing something with Facebook. Yeah, most of that could be wasted time, but there are other things going on behind the scenes that suggest that maybe through this new type of distributed media, a kind of extended bull session is also going on where ideas are being shared, ideas are being debated with each other, and so on and so forth. Maybe, just maybe, this type of peer-based learning is happening that is spread out far beyond the campuses that we're so used to accounting for. In fact, let's just dwell a moment on the notion of the long tail in education. The long tail has been talked about here before with Chris Henderson. I'm sure everybody in here knows this. But how does it apply to education? Well, think about it a moment. 80% of the revenue of virtually every major university comes from 20% of the courses. And 80% of the cost goes to the long tail of these highly specialized niche type of research seminars that, by the way, are being repeated time and time again at virtually every university across this country with 5 or 6 or 7 students attending each particular seminar. One might think, well, maybe there's something we could do about this. But I want to say there's something maybe even more fundamental than looking at how you might link these seminars up together and so on and so forth. Maybe we can kind of invert this whole thing. If we go back to this one, it's very clear the way that kind of our university system is structured is you take your core courses here, and once you specialize, you start moving down this curve to the more and more specialized courses. Think a moment about, might it be possible to kind of invert this entire scheme and say, what would it mean to actually look at kind of a passion-based or kind of these deeply kind of participatory interests you may have in any particular subject that starts down here at the long tail and then starts to migrate up. Consider the hypothesis that there is absolutely almost impossible, some of us call it the compactness theorem, that says no matter how specialized your interest in, at virtually any age, you're going to find already existing on the internet a community of interest that is already studying, talking about, and thinking about that particular interest. What would it mean to be able to discover that and join that, become a legitimate peripheral participant, move to a more central member, start doing things with your learning down here, and then when you get stuck, and you will get stuck, what happens then? You're situated in a problem space that you generated, and then you start becoming more interested in material up here. So it really says, well, maybe we should kind of think about inverting this whole scheme as a new type of institutional structure. Let people find their passion and interest, let them get stuck, and then find ways to kind of, in a spiral form, say, well, okay, now that you're stuck, maybe you want to learn something more about this field, and you see a spiral generating, but this flow starts to move from the long tail up to the fat. But basically the idea is, how do we use kind of this new type of participatory media to think about this rise of an ecology of learning, doing type niches that happen on the net. And this gets us very close to the notion of productive inquiry, a topic that actually started in this city maybe almost 75 years ago with John Dewey, but now kind of reinvented in the digital age where we have, in fact, astronomical amount of resources to use to be able to support this kind of spiral, starting at the interest groups and moving up. And these are just kind of looking at the basic categories of things. OpenCourseWare has probably 6,000 courses now on the net that you can actually look at. Open source movements, games, simulations, and so on and so forth. I could give an hour on any one of these types of things. But that kind of gives you the spirit of what's happening. What I really want to do is now step back and look at this thing from a slightly bigger picture point of view. And I want to do that by starting off with asking, are there some fundamental shifts going on They really should change the way we think of of how we structure most of the institutions that we build for learning today. And I want to suggest that there is at least a fundamental pedagogical shift that is happening, and you might call it the shift from authority-based teaching. And you see why I started out with rethinking authority at the very beginning. Authority-based teaching, which is how every one of us in this room actually got our initial learnings, our initial teachings, to more of a peer-based learning, recognizing the fact that in a rapidly changing world, almost everything we end up learning and using, we probably picked up working with other people in the right kinds of contexts. And let's look at this shift a moment, and let's recognize that the authority-based form of teaching, if you wish, the classrooms, is fundamentally linear. One teacher, many students. But if you recognize peer-based learning, you actually go from kind of a linear scaled n to at a minimal a notion of n squared. And depending how you work this actually moves from n squared to exponential, we'll come back to. So we actually have the whole notion, I call it n squared because the number of conversations that can happen across n people is, of course, basically n squared. If you want to be fancy, n times n minus 1 over 2, but basically an n squared structure. And so the opportunities to learn goes up at least as the square of the number of people you're engaged in. And I'm going to argue later that maybe it's even more exponential than that. What also happens here is, of course, the teaching we're talking about is a one-shot phenomenon. And if we can really make this kind of work over here, we have something that's absolutely continuous. Being exponential in terms of scalability and continuous actually may be the beginnings of how to begin to honor the rapid changes of the world that are going to keep happening if you buy the original hypothesis that basically we no longer have an equilibrium and we're going to be operating in disequilibrium for decades to come. So these two things begin to give us a new take on how we might play this. Obviously, in terms of the teaching, because of this type of structure, all the teaching is basically decontextualized. That's often kind of worshipped because it's considered more abstract, but decontextualization has its own problems. Versus the peer-based learning is almost always situated. You're actually working on things with other people, and in that context, questions come up. So these are not just random conversations. These conversations are often kind of very focused on an issue, an exception, a problem that just happened, something got stuck, something has to be tinkered with, and so on and so forth. And what we really have is some of the best technology operating over here you might actually call the classroom with kind of fancy typed videos and clickers like this and so on and so forth. It still basically is a one-way type system. And over here, we now have this technology that's tremendously viral in terms of the way it's catching on. We'll talk more about it, I'm sure, in the next day and a half, having to do with social network theory. So the new types of Web 2.0 social networking creates the fabric to really accelerate this. So all of a sudden, we have a set of technologies that actually kind of reinforce each other, that may be uniquely situated and suited for actually handling this disequilibrium that I started off talking about to begin with. But it's more than that. Maybe, just maybe, there is something more fundamental, I'm going to call it an epistemological shift. And that is to say, all of us in this room, by and large, were trained under kind of the belief of Homo sapiens. We were taught to worship knowledge, often decontextualized knowledge, in the sense of knowledge was where it was at. But let's suppose what's really happening now is we actually have a shift from Homo sapien to Homo faber. That is to say, I've moved from just abstract knowledge to a sense of knowing that has come by doing, and a sense of knowing that comes from making.